Welcome to Black and Psych, and thank you for coming to our event today. Who is Black and Psych? Black and Psych is a platform to promote visibility, community, and networking opportunities between Black professionals and trainees across the field of psychology. We seek to celebrate, amplify, and support Black voices in psychology and to encourage dialogue around the intersections of psychology, race, social justice, and equity. What we are here for. The Black and Psych organization is founded to one, promote the visibility of Black professionals and trainees in the field of psychology, two, create a community and network of established and aspiring Black psychologists for connection and future collaboration, and three, encourage and hold a space for dialogue around the intersections of psychology, race, social justice, and equity. Who we are here for. Black and Psych is founded to promote visibility, community, and networking opportunities between Black professionals and trainees across the field of psychology, inclusive of all intersectional identities. This is Black and Psych's current team, and you're currently hearing from the current president, Lauren Kendall Brooks. If you're interested in joining our team, please send an email to blackandspsych@gmail.com, visit our website at blackandspsych.org, or follow us on Twitter or Instagram. Also, the QR code listed on the right side of your screen will also take you directly to our website. Thank you, and I hope you would really enjoy today's seminar. It's so good to see everybody. Hello. I'm going to give about another 2 minutes to get started. But feel free, we are going to get started in about, I'd probably say less than a minute because it seems like people are coming in pretty steadily at this point. So I am going to go ahead and pin your video. Well, in just a second. Okay, people are still coming in. I don't want to start too early, but I want to be cognizant of everyone's time and say thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Okay, so hi, my name is Lauren Kendall Brooks. I am the current president of Black and Psych and a co-founder, and I am currently a research scientist, not in academia any longer, but am do a lot of hope to be learning some more about data visualization, all the good stuff about data that I am usually hire other people for. So I need to know just enough so that I can interpret what they're telling me. But we're gonna go ahead and get started. It's been 2 minutes, and I will go ahead and pin your video and pass it over to you.
Sounds good. And it's so nice to meet you online.
Oh, wait,
Hello,
just 1 second. Oh, you're
Oh,
already recording.
oh, I am. Yes, I'm already
Okay,
recording.
I was just about to do
Okay.
that, but okay,
Oh,
thanks.
good. Okay, good. I know technology. I am like, oh,
Yeah, I'll let you go
okay.
ahead and take that then. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, it's so nice to see everyone here. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm super excited to be presenting this workshop on meta-analysis. I'll kind of talk about this in just a minute, but how I would like this to go is I have a lot of material to cover, and I'll kind of reiterate this. Meta-analyses, people spend years training themselves on it. And so I'm really hoping just to get a good introductory baseline, kind of understanding of meta-analysis. Again, setting you up for success to promote your data visualization techniques for meta-analysis and just to kind of get a grasp on it. So I'll stop talking because I have a formal presentation that has all these things in it. All righty. Oops, let's stop my screen share. There we go. All right, and I'm assuming you can see just my slides. Awesome. So yeah, just a little bit about me. So my name is Maria Kalantzis. I am originally from Chicago, and I'm a current fifth year PhD candidate in clinical psychology at Bowling Green State University. And again, I'm just super excited to be here and want to thank Black and Psych for allowing me to present this workshop. I'm a part of the Arab American Psychological Association, and I've directed a lot of folks over to the other data visualization workshops, and they really enjoyed them. So I just want to say awesome for that. And my main research interests are attempting to use dynamic methodologies, so mixed methods, ambulatory assessments, as well as meta-analysis to uncover how stress and psychopathology are related, and specifically stress that is embedded into some sort of systematic oppression, like a culture of stress, discrimination, etc. And so my interest in meta-analyses really began my first year of graduate school because I was interested in this relationship between discrimination and specifically eating disorder symptoms. And I started to notice across the literature there was a lot of discrepancies. And I'm sure folks could attest to that for whatever research interest that they have, is that whether it's like the methods that we use to assess discrimination, methods for, eating disorder symptoms, how that's statistically tested, there was a lot of variability. And I started to wonder, well, is there a way to actually kind of quantify and measure that? And so then I came across meta-analysis, and it was very exciting, but also very scary. Um, Meta-analysis, again, I'll talk about again, can be very intimidating. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. So just again, trying to reiterate throughout this process that it is such a learning by doing sort of technique. And my hope is that you can conjure all the questions up that we have about meta-analysis throughout the talk so that at the end I can answer as many as possible. So I know there's a lot of folks in the chat. I actually would love to hear where folks are from and what they're hoping to get out of this workshop. So if we actually can take a minute just to share your name, your area of study or research interests, and then just your overall goal for today, because that will also help me maybe refine some things as we further along the talk.
Hopefully everyone, can you hear me, Maria?
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. This is Lauren. Yeah, hopefully this also, as you share information, this helps us figure out what types of workshops people want to see next as well. So it's just really helpful, I think, overall. So thank you for this quick, qualitative data.
Yeah, no, that's helpful for me just to, yeah, of course, no problem. Thank you for letting me do that too. Awesome. So yeah, I'm just seeing a quick read. Um, yeah, a lot of different areas and people are in different stages of their meta-analysis, whether just excited to learn about it or currently conducting or at the beginning conducting one. That's really exciting. Awesome. Yeah, so learning more. That's great. Great. So thank you all for sharing it and continue to put in the chat too, because that's helpful information, I know, for folks. Um, So kind of before, again, I'm doing a lot of signposting, but it's important because I want to note that, again, the first time I encountered meta-analysis, I was very overwhelmed. I was kind of turned off. And again, one thing that really helped me was using practice data sets. And so I know Jocelyn is going to, if not already, sent a sample data set that we're actually going to work with in today's workshop that you are more than welcome to use on your own time. And again, it's helpful just to practice. Feel free to download it now. You can also download after the workshop too. And so I like to think of myself as an expert because I am giving a talk on meta-analysis. I have published 3 meta-analyses. I've consulted on a couple. So I like to think of myself as an expert, but I also like to think of myself as this amateur position too, because meta-analyses are highly dynamic. And people, again, spend years training themselves in how to conduct and study meta-analysis. And I've seen this kind of conversation about like, should you do a meta-analysis if you're not trained in meta-analytic techniques? And I kind of lean on the side of like, you just need to learn by doing. And I think this workshop is a great start. And then I also want to point out, again, just from my my experience with trainings on meta-analyses and, synthesizing data, that a lot of people from marginalized backgrounds, not surprisingly, are very much pushed out of quantitative methodology training. So things like meta-analyses. And I'm hoping to help kind of the gatekeeping thing that's going on just in the general quantitative methods training to see that you can do this. So the goals are to acquire knowledge. We're going to give some brief history on meta-analyses. We're going to talk about the gold standard sort of governing body for meta-analysis, which is the PRISMA statement and the PRISMA checklist. And we're going to attempt to apply all the knowledge that we learned to basic practical skills on not only how to search strategically and extract your data, but also, again, to interpret it in a data visualization perspective. And we're going to be talking about 2 data visualization techniques, which are very crucial when you go to present or publish a meta-analysis, which is a funnel plot and a forest plot. I am going to focus on SPSS because I think it is a very accessible tool for meta-analyses. I will be covering a little bit at the end on Excel and how to use that for plotting. But I want to kind of recognize that Excel is really, really good for data management. And I think sometimes folks are like, no, it's like so basic, but it really is so helpful. And so we'll talk more about how you can leverage Excel for your data management for a meta-analysis. So again, thinking about what a meta-analysis is, I hope no matter what your goal for today, no matter where you are in the process of attempting to complete a meta-analysis, I really would like you to think about a meta-analysis as telling a story. Whether you're in the social realm, the clinical realm, counseling, communication sciences, whatever the field that you're in, there is one aim of a meta-analysis, regardless of the research question, is it's going to tell a story. Now, it is a quantitative data analysis technique to try to, again, come up with this cumulative effect size of this relationship you're interested in or this treatment. But it's also trying to tell a story of where it can go. And I like to think about this kind of like a tapestry. So where, again, in a typical cross-sectional study, your unit of analysis would be one participant out of 250 people, let's say. And we were trying to look at the relationship between depression and self-esteem. Again, that unit analysis would be one person. But in a meta-analysis, this becomes more meta, and the unit of analysis becomes your study. And we're trying to weave these studies together to tell a story about where the data in the snapshot of time is, right? This meta-analysis. But it's not supposed to be a number that tells you the capital T truth on that relationship. That's not the point, and we'll learn that. The point is to, again, using data visualization techniques, kind of see, well, where is the story at and where can it go next? So again, I love history, and I feel like learning history about how things came to be can be helpful to actually execute them. So I won't do like a huge history lesson, but just to give a brief background, synthesizing data really came up starting in the 1800s. It was marked by the Enlightenment period and the Age of Reason, and people were really interested in, again, developing philosophy of science and laying the groundwork for, again, empiricism. So we were really good at this time about, doing, not really good, but relatively at that time, really good at doing an observation of a single study. But we didn't really have a good idea of, well, how do we systematically synthesize those data across time or across studies? And so we have this individual to the right, James Lind. He was a Scottish scientist, and he was interested in scurvy. And he was the first person to narratively try to accumulate multiple studies that looked at how to treat scurvy, again, across multiple studies. And then William Farr, kind of a similar person, was interested actually in sanitation and how sanitation could help the deleterious effects of cholera. But again, they did this very narratively. So trying to describe through language and words on how the relation between, sanitation and cholera or the treatment for scurvy was related across time. But then the 20th century came and we had these fancy smancy dudes like Carl Pearson and Jerzy Neiman, and they started to try to not only quantitatively summarize data, but also introduced this concept of confidence intervals, which we'll learn are very key in analyzing and interpreting meta-analytic data. So jumping in after that is Dr. Glass, and he was the first person here to really talk about these levels of analysis that we can do in research and actually conducting and proposing a formal quantitative plan for methodology of a meta-analysis. And then shortly following him was Robert Rosenthal, and he talked about, well, if we're going to quantitatively analyze this, we also need to talk about publication bias and the file drawer problem, which is that, negative or null results are not being reported or published, and how do we account for that in meta-analysis? So moving all the way up to 2007, we had this group of folks that came together and created a system called the Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses, also known as PRISMA. And I really like to think of this as the governing body of meta-analyses and systematic reviews. You cannot, again, publish or present a meta-analysis without following these steps. And it's to ensure standardization, right? Because you could just conduct a meta-analysis and say, I conducted one, right? But where are the rules and regulations that are saying that you're doing it standardized, right? Or doing it in a, statistically sound manner. So just like a brief raise of hands, who here has heard of Prisma before? I'm just curious, I can see in the participants. Anyone? I'm sure folks that have like started doing their thing. Yeah. So yeah, it's brought up a lot, right? Even if it's like in your research methods class, talked about it professionally, it's there. And I think it's a great website. It's also very overwhelming. So again, while we're learning about data viz, I also want to kind of take a step back and talk about, well, how do you kind of interpret and approach Prisma? So we'll get into that. Um, so thinking about what the term, what does a meta-analysis, what is it, right? A very condensed definition is it's a statistical technique, and we combine and we analyze multiple independent studies to quantify a weighted effect size. And we want to assess data characteristics of studies as potential moderators and draw more, again, generalized conclusions about your research questions. Now, and the hope here is that, all studies have flaws, and there's hopes that the studies that have flaws are accompanied by other studies that have similar or opposite strengths, right? So meaning that across all studies, we're going to at least have an effect size or an inferential statistic of something that we're interested in and going to review across studies. And again, this is becoming an very ever more popular technique, especially during the COVID pandemic. A lot of folks said, I don't have data to work with, so I'm going to, turn to synthesizing data. So again, in the resource guide, we have some talk about this too, of like, there's real limitations also to conducting meta-analysis. So I want to kind of say that up in the forefront, that when we're approaching meta-analysis, it's not a perfect method to synthesize data. But it really should kind of say that, meta-analysis is not the endpoint, right? It's not a this is it. It's again a signal of where we can go. So again, just a little kind of like visualization of like where do meta-analyses lie on the sort of quality of evidence or the spectrum of how you can collect and synthesize evidence. This pyramid to the left really showcases like how as the quality goes up, we kind of aspire for meta-analyses to be that sort of like top quality, synthesizing quantitatively effect sizes from all these different studies of cohort studies and cross-sectional studies on this relationship around this treatment effect that we're interested in. And again, it's not perfect, but our hope is that it's going to, again, systematically quantify that. And the question is like, well, why should you conduct one? And why maybe you shouldn't conduct one? I think a couple questions can come up to mind for you. So number one, always going back to the research question, right? What is your research question? I'll give examples of what this might look like in a bit. And how is your research question typically answered in the literature? So for example, if your question is very like critical, qualitative, and there's a lot of like focus groups and semi-structured interviews that attempt to answer this question, a meta-analysis probably isn't your answer because again, number one, meta-analysis is a quantitative data technique. And also there's great qualitative narrative techniques you can look into to help with answering that question. And then another question that you need to ask yourself, well, how new is the topic that you're interested in positioned into the literature? So technically, you can do a meta-analysis with two studies. Now, it's very much not recommended because you can't really assess for heterogeneity across two studies, but it's possible. But thinking about, well, how new is my topic? That can kind of help you position, well, should I maybe do a scoping review versus a systematic review? But if you're finding that your research topic, there's, again, these robust studies that have quantitatively examined, again, either two constructs or more, or again, treatment effects, maybe the meta-analysis is a great, again, data analytic choice for you. And I give two examples here about or kind of showcasing, well, what can a research question look like that's more positioned in a systematic review? And what would a research question look like that's more positioned as a meta-analysis? And I think a lot of it comes down to if you're interested in more kind of like theoretical approaches or different mechanisms in which like your research question might be answered. So for example, I published a meta-analysis on the relation between the culture of stress and eating disorder psychopathology. There's a lot of different methods and mechanisms in which that can come to be. The systematic review part might be looking and kind of narratively describing those mechanisms and how they're different from each other. Where the meta-analysis really is interested in, if I were to use an example of self-esteem and social anxiety, well, what is the overall strength of the association between self-esteem and social anxiety across different age groups, right? That would be a meta-analysis, right? Because we need to do a quantitative meta-analytic data technique, and then we can also do what we call meta-regression or moderation analysis to kind of see, well, at these different age groups, how do these effect sizes differ? So again, what a meta-analysis is going to help you achieve is to identify, again, this pattern, right, to some degree, right, that comprehensive effect size across the relation between two constructs or treatment effects, but also to systematically identify, well, where are the gaps at? And I kind of talked about how we can use meta-analyses from a health disparities framework and say, in your data characteristics table, which we'll talk about, you'll see, oh my gosh, like what if I'm doing a study on, discrimination broadly defined and, again, I'm going to use my research topics of like emotional eating, but we're finding that a lot of folks are cis white women, right? That's a problem. And so we need to systematically identify that by saying, oh, here are the percentage of studies that had a racial breakdown. Here are the percentage of studies that actually had people of color in them in the first place, right? So again, identifying gaps systematically, also helping to identify key moderators, so what might impact the relationship between the constructs you're interested in. And again, thinking about that tapestry, it's going to signal, well, where should we go next in the literature? And then just a note on what they can't do, and I think it's really important to know what they can't do, is again, I've heard sentiments that like, again, meta-analyses are like the end all be all, like they're the capital T truth. I'm going to then cite, this meta-analysis is like, this is the relationship between these two constructs, and this causes this. And while I would love for that to be the answer, it is unfortunately not that simple. And so when we're thinking about meta-analyses, oftentimes, especially in psychology or things like communication studies, we're looking at cross-sectional data, right, most of the time. And so just like we can infer or establish causality in cross-sectional work, we really also can't infer or establish causality in meta-analysis, right? We're really trying to, again, unveil that bivariate nature of the relationship, for example, but we're not here to say, this predictor causes this outcome. Another thing that it won't do is obviously replace primary research. Again, this point of this workshop is not to say, abandon all primary research and focus all your energy on meta-analyses. And I see part of my number 3 got cut off, but addressing all sources, and I'll fix this for the final slides, of publication bias, because one of the data visualization techniques that we will learn is a funnel plot, which attempts to address and visualize that publication bias that might be happening in your meta-analysis. And while it helps address and visually see it, it doesn't fix it, right? So it's just, again, signaling and showcasing maybe where the publication bias lies. And then again, just like, anything else, it doesn't really address individual variability. I have seen more recent meta-analyses come out that are trying to, again, look at like EMA data and like trying to analyze within-person effects across studies, which I think is very interesting, but again, not the point of our talk. So again, just a lot of signposting, but it's really important to set us up about, well, what are we assuming in meta-analyses? We are assuming that you have studies in your meta-analysis that are independent from each other, right? So this means that data from one study should not be overlapping with the data from another. And we're also assuming that you're gathering your studies in a random way, which means that you're creating search terms and searching these strategically in different databases and filtering out data or filtering out your data points, meaning your study based upon various criteria, et cetera, et cetera. And you're not just picking and choosing what studies you want to include. We're also assuming that the data that you are including is accurate and reliable, right? Because we're going to be producing an overall effect size and visually kind of describing each study's effect size and how it relates to the overall one. We're also going to be, again, looking at publication bias. So we are assuming that the data that you're, again, reporting on from each study is accurate and reliable. And then we're assuming that each study that you're reporting on has some sort of effect size, whether it's a mean difference, an odds ratio, and we'll talk about later how whatever it is, you're going to need to calculate it into a common effect size statistic. And then again, I kind of said this before, but we're assuming that there is some sort of publication bias that might be occurring in your meta-analysis, because we do know that significant findings are more likely to be published in the literature. So looking at the PRISMA guidelines, and I'm actually going to attempt to chat this to everyone really quick. So I know I had it as like a thing on the resource guide, but I want to also just have folks look at it while I'm talking about it. And if that doesn't work, also you can just look at my screen. But the PRISMA guidelines are essentially a necessary guide and a necessary checklist to completing your meta-analysis. And it takes you all the way from your title, all the way to your conclusion and discussion. And again, we won't have time to go through every checkpoint, but I'm hoping throughout this talk, we can kind of refer to it and see how does that checklist align with the data analysis and the data management that you're going to be doing in a meta-analysis. So let us get started. Okay, I'm going to do it. We got this. So here is a research question that I have. So let's say I want to conduct a meta-analysis on the relationship between race-related stress and cardiovascular outcomes. Well, first, according to the PRISMA guidelines, I need to clearly state and describe my objectives in my research question. So a research question would be, what are the most common measurements of race-related stress, of cardiovascular outcomes? When the researchers are, researching these two constructs, are they measuring race-related stress by a validated self-report measure? Are they, using some sort of ambulatory assessment? Are they using a yes/no question? How are they measuring race-related stress? And the same thing for cardiovascular outcomes, as I'm sure some folks know, the way in which we can operationalize cardiovascular outcomes is highly heterogeneous. So is it cortisol? Is it some sort of like diastolic blood pressure, right? So trying to understand that. I also might want to understand, well, what are the distributions of study designs across studies? So are they mostly cross-sectional, laboratory-based? And again, that key question of, well, what is the strength and association between these two constructs? And what are the most common study characteristics that come up in these studies? And do these moderate the relationship? So things like gender identity, age, and like we think about, again, in a typical cross-sectional study, where we might look at age as a moderator on the relation between race-related stress and cortisol, for example, we kind of up that up into the meta-analysis and say, well, if most of our studies are reporting age, then maybe I can look at that as a moderation in a meta-analysis. And what are the different subgroups that are emerging in our data? Are they mostly coming from countries in the West, so like United States or Canada? And can I potentially look at those differences? Clinical status, are folks coming in with a diagnosable mental health condition? Things like that can help us kind of interpret, and we'll see if there's heterogeneity, we can actually use that to inform a moderation analysis. So again, seeing how these are mapped out, we can again say, all right, we have our research questions and our objectives, and we can kind of check that off the list. Now, I think the thing that becomes most daunting for folks in a meta-analysis is really trying to get that final N, that number of studies that's going to be in your meta-analysis. And I really like to think about it like you're looking up at the top of a mountain with all these different studies that you could include. And you're like, where the heck do I start, right? And I truly will say this, I believe that refining and getting to the final number of studies is the toughest part of a meta-analysis. It's actually not the analytic part, or creating like your data viz stuff. It's really about like including and excluding studies to get to that final number. And so while this workshop is not solely focused on that, I did want to talk about that. So thinking about defining your search terms and where you should start. There are several places that you can look to. I've listed some here. So things like PubMed, PsycInfo, Web of Science, Embase, and Crokin Library. These are all different things that people use typically for social science research. And a really good tip is if you have an interest in a meta-analysis, look at one that's done at least, I mean, it should be at least one of the constructs you're interested in and see what search engines they used. Prisma, to my knowledge, doesn't have some sort of standardized guide of like what search engines you should use, but you should be using at least 3 as like the typical standard number. Now, a big thing I like to put in bold and underline is do not use Google Scholar for searching your studies. And you might be wondering, well, why? Because it's such a good search engine and it populates like thousands of things. That's actually why we shouldn't be using it, because Google Scholar is great for capturing a lot of different things that are not relevant to our search terms. And to filter out in Google Scholar is way more difficult. So I just really highly encourage folks to pick 3 and to not pick Google Scholar. I have, at least not to my knowledge, seen a meta-analysis that has used Google Scholar and systematically included excluded studies. And I think after you see how this process works, you'll be like, oh yeah, I don't want to use Google Scholar. So tracking your studies. I think that Excel is amazing. It's an amazing way to track your number of studies that you're including and excluding at every stage. And this template will also be available to folks after the workshop. This is an example of how you can pick your search terms and how you can kind of organize, well, what are the initial ends that I'm getting from each search engine, from each kind of combination of search results. And this is going to kind of align with, and I'll go way back for a second, with this Prisma flow chart, right? Because they need to know right when you do your search terms, how many are showing up, right? So that's going to help us see at the beginning what's out there. So again, this is a great way to do a starting point and to track it in Excel. And in terms of creating your search terms, I again suggest going to a previous meta-analysis or a systematic review that's looked at constructs that you're interested in. But I also, again, you can also just think about, well, what is my construct? How am I operationally defining it in my introduction, in my primary aims, and then using that as a tool to like define your search terms. Because in this example, I'll talk about with the study, I'm actually going to pare it down to cortisol because there's too many studies to do a meta-analysis, at least in my time, for just doing cardiovascular outcomes. And so that will help you again pare down what you're interested in. So again, if I'm looking at, race-related stress, well, that can be operationalized in literature as we know as ethnic stress and discrimination and microaggressions, right? So again, that helps us pare down and filter out what search terms we need to use. And just a little sidebar is that you might go to send a paper out for review, a meta-analysis, and the reviewers will come back and be like, well, why didn't you include this search term, right? And depending on what search term they offer, you have 2 choices to either include it or try to build an argument for why not. And I, again, suggest that folks keep in mind that they are experts in this topic, right? Because you've done the hours and hours of work to complete a meta-analysis. And so again, I will say this over and over again if folks need any individual kind of consulting on how to word things to reviewers or how to kind of define your constructs, I'm more than happy to help with that too. So going back to that Prisma guideline sheet, they're asking us not only to kind of share, well, what was your search strategy, but the levels in which you searched and selected studies. And they want to know it at 3 different levels, well, actually technically 4. So the title review is the first level. So let's say we got all of those studies, right? All those search terms. And there's a number of ways to actually kind of export those. And that's also in the resource guide. So let's say I searched all my search terms and I exported them to my Zotero file, right? So I have about like, let's say 600 studies. I'm now going to do what's called a title review, where I'm going to go through each title and I'm going to say, is this title relevant or not to my study? Now, how you operationalize relevance is also really important. The title does not need to have both of your constructs, for example, in the title for it to be included, because in fact, what we'll find is that sometimes effect sizes can be pulled from studies where it wasn't the primary aim of the study. So for example, again, if I'm interested in race-related stress and cortisol, I could go through titles and see, the impact of race-related stress on health. Well, health could include cardiovascular outcomes. It could also include cortisol. So I'm gonna include it, right? Versus, when I laugh, like I do meta-analyses and some of the titles that come up, they're like doing research on like, I don't know, random animals. And I'm like, okay, not relevant, right? Again, at the title level. So then once you screen through the title level, you then go down to the abstract review and then the full text review. And thankfully, what I find is it's seldom that you go through the abstract review and then you also have to do a full text review, again, unless the primary aim wasn't those constructs that you're interested in, they weren't in the abstract. And so then you have to do that full text review, but you're needing to include the number of studies that you're including and excluding at each stage, right? And then the final review is this inclusion and exclusion. So let's say like I did my full text review, I did my abstract review, and I did my title review, and they all seem relevant to my research questions. Well, now I need to go further into each article and see, okay, this is just an example, is it peer reviewed, right? Is it sometimes folks have an inclusion criteria of they need to be written in English, which I have a lot of thoughts about. And I'll talk about the end of how you can actually use meta-analysis or use studies that are not in English for your meta-analyses. They need to have a reliable and valid measure, for example, of race-related stress, and a reliable and valid measure of cardiovascular outcomes, right? And let's say for intents and purposes of simplicity, I'm not including things that we call gray literature, which would be things like dissertations or non-peer-reviewed studies. So that would get me to my final number of studies, which we'll see in a second is 10. Now, I don't know about you all, but hearing this for the first time, I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds like so much work, especially if, I'm interested in a research topic that's, really dense and there's a lot of studies. And so not only we'll talk about how organization can really help you in this process, but this is where team science really comes into play and collaborative science. And I think this is also a really good skill to train undergrads. So in the couple of meta-analyses that I've done, I've trained about from 5 to 7 undergraduate research assistants on doing like the screening and searching. And I think it's a great learning tool, not only because they're getting in-depth kind of search of like the literature on whatever you're researching, but also they're learning about data synthesis, which at the undergraduate level, I would say is not that prevalent. So I think it's just a great learning opportunity for undergraduates, if you're a graduate student or a faculty member. And yeah, it just helps with the time, right? So I, again, always suggest when you're approaching this, you're like, this seems like so much. Well, this is where, again, collaboration can really come into play, and it's super important. So some folks have also thought, well, okay, I have all these like studies, where do I put them? And I kind of signaled to this earlier. A really good place to use or to store all of your studies is Zotero. And here's a way in which I just helped with a meta-analysis, how we organize studies. So this is actually at like the final include and exclude stage. So I think there was about 750 articles that we needed to do like a full text review of, and then to do like an inclusion exclusion criteria. And obviously that was way too much for one person. And so we were able to bring on about three undergraduates, research assistants, and we were able to split up the studies. And they were able to do a full text review, inclusion exclusion criteria. We trained them on what to look for, where to look for in the study, and we're able to create folders based upon that. And then me and the PI were able to kind of take that and we'll talk about this towards the end about how you and the other person can go through the full text review to kind of do a quality bias assessment on how, again, the final number of studies that you're all choosing, well, what really should be included based on that criteria. So again, Zotero is a great reference manager, and I have it linked in the resource guide as well. Very good. So the next piece here is coding your data characteristics. And I'm seeing a couple questions in the chat, which I will absolutely get to at the end. But I can quickly answer this one actually, that asked about, does each study have to be evaluated to researchers? So the standard is that, just to quickly say, at the final level, so when you're doing that inclusion exclusion criteria, you're going to do something called a quality bias assessment. And you do need two researchers to do that because you're going to calculate an inter-rater reliability, which is something that you might do if you're doing qualitative work. Basically saying, well, how much did you folks agree upon the quality of each included study? And where the discrepancies lie, explain that. And again, I'm happy to answer that more in depth at the end, but great question. Okay, so we have our data, right? Let's say we have all of our studies that we are going to include. Now, what do we want to take out or extract from our studies? Great question. The first thing first is you always want to include more than less in your studies when you're creating and coding your study characteristics table, because this is actually going to end up being your table one for your meta-analysis publication or presentation. And table one in a meta-analysis is usually all the studies that you included and all of the data characteristics of each study, and then their effect size, which we'll get to in a second. So things like sample characteristics, racial and ethnic breakdown, socioeconomic status, age. If you're doing more clinical or counseling, you want to include, is this a clinical sample, right? And if it is a clinical sample, how much of the participants are of that clinical sample? Another thing that you would want to code is the measures. So the name of the measure, the type of measure, and the psychometric quality of that measurement. And this is really important, not only for potentially looking at subgroup analyses of like, well, how do effect sizes pooled look differently in one measurement over the other? But also, again, we're trying to tell a story, right? We're trying to signal where can the literature, where can the research go next? And this is a great way to say, well, wow, across all these studies, only one used a psychometrically validated measurement, right? That had internal consistency above 0.8, for example, right? So again, this information is going to be descriptive, but it's also going to inform your discussion about the future steps. And then I included in our presentation for today a sample CSV coding sheet, which again, I will include in the final presentation that will be sent to you all. And it's very messy on purpose because it's going to attempt to show you, well, wow, you can really include a lot at the get-go of what you want to extract from your data. And if we have time at the end, I'll actually stop sharing my screen and go through what it looks like. Okay. So when we're thinking about now, not the descriptive information, but the inferential statistics, this is where things become a little more tricky. So the first thing that you are going to absolutely need when you're coding your inferential statistic information is the sample size. And we're going to learn a bit on how absolutely important it is for you to include and necessary to include your sample size. Another important thing, if they do offer it, is your degrees of freedom. And then also the inferential statistic. So again, you're looking in that paper, right, that has that relationship between race-related stress and cortisol output. And I'm going through the tables and I'm finding that one number that's expressing that relationship. That's bingo, right? That's the one I want. And I want to see, well, what type of effect size is it, right? And you want to code that as it's a t-test, or it's R, or it's not even, sometimes they don't even report the actual effect size, they report a p-value, right? You want to code that. And not only are you going to need that effect size, but you're going to need, I put this in bold and all caps, yelling, you need standard error and or your confidence intervals. And this is really, really important. And I know standard error and variance and confidence intervals can be absolutely confusing, but to kind of just briefly summarize, the standard error of the effect size or the estimate of the variance of the effect size is super important because it's a precision measurement. The standard error is really indicating how precise the study's effect size is estimating that thing, right? So the smaller effect size means the estimate is more precise, and the larger effect size means it's less precise. And we're going to learn this is really important when we're weighting our effect sizes into our overall effect, because combining results from different studies, we need to give more or less weight to studies with more precise estimates, meaning a smaller standard error, and less weight to those with less precise estimates, so a larger standard error. And again, you're probably going to need to convert your effect sizes to one standardized effect because, again, we think about cortisol and race-related stress. I've seen t-tests that have examined that. I've looked at mean differences. There's been, again, just like regular R statistic. There's been, Cohen's d. So all these different effect sizes that can be produced, we are going to need to convert them into one standardized effect. Now, I don't have time today to go through the math on like how that's done, but thankfully there's a Excel sort of program called Meta-Excel, which I'm linking in the PowerPoint at the end, that actually walks you through how to convert these effect sizes and how to do them standardized and not just doing them by hand, which again is exciting to do, but you want to get something more precise to do it. So that's good. And then when we're thinking about, well, what if a study has multiple effect sizes? And what do I mean by that? So let's say, like, scratching that research question for a second, let's say I was interested in how discrimination broadly defined is related to cortisol output. Well, we know discrimination is a highly heterogeneous construct. It can mean a lot of different things. And so let's say I had about half my studies that looked at discrimination and cortisol output, and there was one effect size for each. That's great. And then about half of my studies actually looked at specific facets of discrimination. So like race-related discrimination and then gender-based discrimination. And they report two effect sizes. Now, my research question is about discrimination broadly. And so what do? Do I ignore the one that I don't want? Do I ignore the one that's, not statistically significant? The answer is no, obviously. We want to include both of them. And there's various methods to doing this. And again, this is something that's definitely a post-workshop conversation, but I've linked in the resource guide on what you can do. Just a little brief kind of talk about that. What I've seen being done is simply averaging them because they're coming from the same, we're assuming, sample size. There's also ways to actually weight average the effect sizes within a study. Again, I've also included that in the resource guide as well. Oh, and the last thing too, about this, I forgot to mention, is again, only focusing on the hypothesis tests that involve the key independent and dependent variables you're interested in, right? So there might be effect sizes that you're like, oh my God, that's so interesting, or that looks kind of related. Remember, always going back to the research question and your operational definitions of the constructs you're interested in. And while it might seem awesome to include, it might create more problems than not because you might be kind of muddling the actual construct that you're really trying to tap into by including more relevant constructs. And I've seen this happen when I've consulted on meta-analyses where they're really interested in this one specific thing and we can't really get a lot from that. And so like, oh, I'll just include this related thing. And then you have to have this conversation of like, well, that's not the construct you're interested in. And so maybe a systematic review again is more applicable for you in that case. So again, just really remembering that we're focusing on what is that operational definition of the constructs you're interested in. Very good. So this is the example data set that I produced for folks. I'm going to walk through it now. I suggest actually like not, you can't open it up. You can open it now if you want to, but just watching me the first time and then maybe going back to the recording and trying it out yourself, I think would be really helpful. So here is our or not our output, but our data. So remember the unit of analysis is our study. So I'm going to get my little laser out here. So this is the study number. Now, in actuality, when you're inputting your data, you would want to put the author and the year, which you'll see on table 1 for the example. So let's say this like Smith et al. 2012, right? But I just numbered them to make it more simple. And then this is the standard effect or the effect size that I put into the same format across studies, and we're using R in this case. And then remember, we need standard error. So here's standard error. And again, we need sample size. Here is the sample size. Now, if you have standard error, you're not going to need your 95% confidence intervals, but we're just going to assume that maybe some studies didn't have it, so I needed it. So I'm also including that in the data set as well. And again, we're going to learn more about or kind of talk more about like how does the lower and upper level confidence intervals play into interpreting our meta-analytic data. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. So again, remembering that the smaller standard error indicates a more precise estimate, and then the larger indicates a less precise estimate. So let us move on here. So before we, again, get into the fun data viz stuff, I do want to note like how we interpret the inferential stats that come from a meta-analysis. And again, the first time that I looked at an output of a meta-analysis, I was like, what are all these letters doing on my page? I've never heard of, I mean, I heard of tau squared before, but I was like, I squared, I didn't even know that was a thing. So totally valid if you've like ever seen outputs and you're like, I don't understand what these are. So this could be a whole class, so I'm not gonna like go super in depth into it, but just to kind of simply summarize, you're going to see 3 statistics come up. You'll also see something called an H squared, which again, I've found is less relevant, but you want to focus on these 3 key statistics that you're going to see. So let's say again, I have my data set and I want to go and look at the overall effect size, right? I want to get a weighted effect size from all these different effect sizes, given their standard errors and their sample size. Well, tau squared is basically going to tell me it's a measure of variance, basically saying, well, here is the variance of the true effect size across studies. So it's attempting to quantify what is the degree of between study heterogeneity. So basically the extent to which the true effect size is differing from each other beyond what we would expect by chance. And the usage of this, it's basically to help us see, well, how much variability is existing in effect sizes. And it's very much used, I think, only used in random effects meta-analyses to account for variability. The next thing is I squared. So we have I squared here, and it's a percentage. And it's basically telling us the percentage of total variability in the effect size that's due to, again, that between study heterogeneity. So the effect sizes are between studies, again, rather than chance. Its measure of heterogeneity, again, it's expressed as a percentage, which I think is easier to interpret. And then the last thing that we'll talk about is the Q statistic. I think it's probably the more important one. It's coupled by a p-value, and it's indicating the variability overall. And it's suggesting that more so of heterogeneity, and the lower the Q value would be, that means that there's a presence of substantial heterogeneity. It may indicate that, studies are differing significantly in the results, possibly due to like the study conditions or methodologies. And again, this is coupled with a p-value. And if the p-value again is below that 0.05, we can assume that there is statistically significant heterogeneity. So again, we'll talk more about this in a bit, but I just wanted to introduce these formulas to you, and then a note on what these data viz techniques actually are. So there's two main types of ways to visualize your meta-analytic data. There's funnel plots, and then there's forest plots, hence why I put a funnel and picture of a forest. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a forest plot. And the forest plot's main usage is to basically visually represent each study's effect size and the overall pooled effect size, as well as their confidence intervals. And it displays the study's results, the confidence intervals, and it's basically trying to visualize the consistency across studies as well as that overall pooled effect. The funnel plot is the next thing we'll talk about, and it's a visual tool to detect publication bias, basically looking at standard errors plotted against, or effect sizes plotted against standard errors. And we'll talk about how to visualize this based upon symmetry. And the more symmetrical that your data points are in a funnel plot, the less bias there is. And then the more asymmetrical they are, the more that's indicating there might be a publication bias. Very good. So let us jump into it. So again, remember, we're using this data set here, okay? And I'm going to go into SPSS, and I wish I could just unshare my screen and walk through it live, but my computer will crash, so I'm not going to do that. So looking step by step, we go to Analyze. There's a nifty button for meta-analysis, and you get three options here. Now, this workshop is focused on continuous data. I've referenced I think about 3 studies that talk about how to handle data with binary outcomes. And so if you're interested in a research question, which the outcome variables like yes, no, 0, 1, would be like an odds ratio, then we can talk about how you do that in those readings. Again, also happy to talk after the workshop too about that. But again, we're doing continuous outcomes, so we're going to click on that. And then there's these 2 options that come up. Now, SPSS does give you the ability to input your raw data before you've calculated your effect size. So something like a mean difference. Now, I suggest that you use a resource like the Meta Excel, which I'll be giving at the end. There's also a resource I've listed, which is called Comprehensive Meta-Analysis, and that actually will convert your effect sizes for you, which is really, really nice. So again, for the sakes and purposes of today's workshop, we're assuming that we've already pre-calculated our effect sizes. So inputting our data points, it's very simple and straightforward. And this is why I love SPSS to teach, again, the basics of meta-analysis, because you're quite literally putting the effect size, where the effect size goes, where we've already got our standard error. The study ID is measured by the study. So study 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And so we put our variables in where we need to. And then we click on trim and fill. Trim and fill is something that you're going to need to know for conducting a meta-analysis. And trim and fill is alike sort of the funnel plot, where it's a statistical method used to address publication bias. So the trim is the method that we try to identify studies that may be missing due to publication bias. So it's basically trimming, aka removing, these studies from the meta-analysis to correct for this bias. And then it's filling or adding hypothetical studies to your meta-analysis to kind of fill in the gaps. And these hypothetical studies are created based on whatever effect sizes and variances or standard errors you give in your included studies. Now, looking at this button we see at the bottom, I hear this question a lot. I see a lot of debate about this, about like the random effects model or the fixed effects. And based upon, again, my thorough reading and doing this, I say, unless you are doing a meta-analysis on highly controlled, randomized control trials, you want to do random effects. Random effects is basically modeling it in a more conservative manner, and it's assuming that there's levels of variance across your studies. Now, since we are psychology and the social sciences broadly defined, we probably know that there's going to be some sort of heterogeneity or variance across our studies due to demographic characteristics or the study design. So random effects is always the best option for that. But again, I have seen meta-analyses that have looked at, looking at the effects of a treatment using highly controlled randomized control trials, and they've used fixed effects. So very good. So looking at, so we've clicked determine fill. And again, we want to do the estimate number of missing studies as well as the fill. And when we're thinking about what is the iteration process that we want to do in our trim and fill, we also want to do random effects models. And we want to do something called the restricted maximum likelihood. Now, I've seen people toggle in meta-analyses between maximum likelihood and restricted maximum likelihood. So I've included a reading about when you decide to do which one. But typically the restricted maximum likelihood is going to provide a more accurate and less biased estimate of all the variance components that are happening. And when we're doing a random effects model, it's always going to be sort of included with this NAP hard tongue correction or adjustment. And basically it's going to say, well, with the random effects meta-analysis, we know that there's going to be variability between studies. So it's going to be more precise in sort of measuring the confidence intervals by accounting for variability and effect sizes across studies, including those confidence intervals as well. Okay, so we already talked about what you can choose. So now that we've inputted all of our variables, we're going to want to actually produce some data from it, right? So the first step is to go to plot, and yes, it's really all there. If you were to do this in R, it'd be way different, but SPSS is so nice, and they give us a button for plots. So you're going to click on the plot button, and then there's going to be 4 options that come up for you. It'll be forest plot, bubble plot, funnel plot, and Galbraith plot, which I have not actually used before, nor the bubble plot. We're going to focus today again on those 2, the forest and the funnel plots. And what we want to do in our forest plot is, remember, this is a way for us to visualize all of the effect size information, the confidence intervals, and its weight with each study, as well as that overall effect size. So again, you want to display columns that have everything. The only reason why I did not include a p-value for this is because we're going to assume that in your study data characteristics table, your table 1, you're already going to report that information, and that's just a personal choice. But you absolutely can click on p-value, just knowing that you don't want to repeat it probably in more than one place. Okay, so this is what SPSS produces. It's really nice. So let's kind of break down what each part means. So if we look here on the left, this is visualizing or saying, each study. Now remember, if you were to publish this, you'd want to actually put the author and in parentheses the year that it was published in. The first column here is the effect. We have the lower and upper level limits. We have the weight and the weight percent, which is basically saying, okay, we took the standard error, we took, again, with the sample size and the effect size, and this is basically the weighted percentage of how much it's attributing to that overall effect size here at the bottom. So visually, looking here to the forest plot on the right, we can see a lot of things going on. So first, we see a bunch of blue boxes. These are representing the effect size, right? So we have our X here, which is, again, the effect size number. And we have this red line that's representing that overall weighted effect size over here, which is about 0.45. And so each study is being represented here with its respective effect sizes. And the bigger the blue box is, the bigger the weighted effect size is. And you can see there's actually large variability in the weighted effect sizes. So for example, this study here, pretty large effect size and a respectively shorter confidence interval, as opposed to this study, which has a very, very, very small effect size and a very large confidence interval. Okay. So again, remembering how this is relating to standard error. So we're thinking about, again, confidence intervals as some sort of like uncertainty of where the estimate is. Sometimes folks are interpreting that when we're thinking about like 95% confidence interval, that it means there's a 95% chance that the data point falls within that range. I've learned that's wrong in my time as a graduate student. That's not correct. It's more about the precision, again, thinking about that standard error. And if you want to learn more, there is a podcast called Quantitude, and they have a great talk on confidence intervals. But again, we're going to interpret that in a wider confidence interval is going to indicate greater uncertainty about the estimate. And again, it's suggesting that estimate could be varying more or less. And again, due to factors like that small sample size or just greater variability in the data. And then when we look to the bottom here, and I'm just looking at the chat, see if there's anything I can answer really quick. The inverse between. Yes, so the relationship, so someone asked, just to clarify, the relationship is inverse between effect size and confidence intervals. So yes, so this is the effect size here. And again, if this is not your question, you can also ask at the end. But briefly, this is the effect size here. This is the individual effect sizes, and these are the confidence interval ranges. And I have a or not a worksheet, but a sheet at the end that talks about how standard error and confidence intervals and variance are all mathematically related to each other. But again, if that didn't answer your question, you can follow up at the end. And so we're seeing that there are a lot of studies that are, again, pushing towards this overall effect size, but there's this greater variability, right? And when we look at the bottom here, which produces that tau, the h squared, which again, not as important, but the I squared that we're talking about, we're seeing that there's actually not a lot of variability. And these numbers, right? So specifically the I squared can kind of signal, well, should we further assess for heterogeneity and doing things such as subgroup analyses or maybe things such as moderation analyses. And again, we'll get more into that in a bit. So that's the forest plot. And again, the resource guide, I provided examples on how you can, with language, interpret the forest plot and talk about it. I've seen a lot of different styles and how people sort of interpret and talk about the forest plots. But again, breaking it down from like, and I think this is a great visualization technique of like, where are the studies that have really good, again, like precision of their effect sizes versus not. And I think it's actually really interesting to look at it in relation to like the year it was published, as well as other data characteristics, because you can see again across time, how are things being measured and how is it relating to precision? I think that's also really important. All right, so that was the forest plot. Now we want to say or look at, well, what is the publication bias, if at all, occurring in this meta-analysis? Again, it's very simple. We're going to go back to that analyze, going to go to that plots button, and we're going to click on funnel plot, and you're going to want to choose standard error because remember, we want to see, again, the precision of the effect size, and we're going to assume that again, remembering the smaller the effect size gets, the more precise the estimate is going to be. And I've actually seen this before in papers where folks have like just plotted the effect size and plotted the standard error, and they're like, oh, we're all good to go. Well, there's a lot of problems with that because we don't actually know where this is in relation to not only the overall effect size, but that lower level and the upper level of confidence intervals, right? And we want to know where they're descending from. And again, seeing is there a symmetrical or asymmetrical distribution of effect sizes? So we're going to plot this. It's automatically going to plot your data inverse for the standard error, as you can see. So let's talk about what this all is. So this is what will come up on your output. We have the standard error and we have the effect size. We have the standard error going down because remember, the lower it is, the more precise that effect size is. And kind of visually what we would want to see is that there's even distribution of effect sizes to the left and to the right of this overall effect size. And it would kind of sort of conceptualize as like a symmetrical funnel, hence why it's called a funnel plot. And we would see more precise studies, so smaller standard error, clustering around the effect size, and then less precise studies trickling down, which we are sort of seeing. But we really are noticing what? A lot of the studies are to the left of this overall random model effect size, right? And only a couple are to the right. Now, what does this mean? This might suggest that smaller studies with non-significant results or null results are missing from our analysis. And this is a very common sign of publication bias. Now, I want us to note in this specific data set that I created, there's no negative results. So like no negative bivariate relations between race-related stress and cortisol output. And I think including negative results, if you find them in your meta-analysis, that's going to change how this publication bias plot looks. And again, I've included studies that have that in the resource guide. But again, this is just to see that, okay, studies with non-significant negative results are probably not being published because we don't have that symmetrical distribution from left to right. So again, we can assume that there is publication bias coming up from here. Now, I want to say that's not the only reason that you would have publication or you would have an asymmetrical funnel. So this is from Edgar, and this talks about all the different reasons why we might see heterogeneity or this asymmetrical plot in the funnel plot. And yes, there is some publication bias that could be happening, but there's also these other biases that can be happening, which language bias is a big one, citation bias, or multiple publication bias. Again, I have a reading that talks about these more in depth, but I think a big one that's coming up, again, I've seen a meta-analysis, is not including studies that were published in non-English. And I think folks are afraid of publishing studies in non-English, not because they don't want to, but because they don't have the resources to adequately translate. And so a couple thoughts about that. I think one thing is, the importance of team and collaborative science and working with people that don't look or are not from where you're from, right? So don't look like you, are not from where you're from, have different backgrounds because they have cultural connections that might be different than yours. And that's why it's super important to work with folks that are, again, not from your area, because they can help with this, right? But another piece too is there are translation services available for studies. Now, it's a little murky in terms of like the quality, but again, I put a couple in the resource guide on how you can get an article translated into English. And I know now most publications or journals are offering texts that are posted in non-English into English. But if we're thinking about like how do we actually access these articles, a lot of times they're not in traditional search engines. So they might be like in the actual library databases of universities that are abroad. So again, thinking about your research question and where it also might be being studied at that's not in the United States or Canada is super important. So not only is this kind of signaling, potential bias, but it also could be that there is a great heterogeneity. And I've been seeing this a lot in meta-analyses that look at specifically like cultural differences, and then have studies that are just from these really unique, distinct cultural groups. Because again, we would assume that those cultural, factors are implicating the results differently. And so I think a big thing to take away here is that, again, your heterogeneity statistics and the funnel plot are going to signal that there's something going on, right? Whether it's they're heterogeneous or not. But it's also signaling that, okay, potentially it's not because of like the publication bias, but also because there's true heterogeneity. There's also things such as data, irregularity. So things like poor methodological design. If you're including a bunch of studies that have like a sample size of 50 and reporting like 6 or 7 effect sizes, right? Like that's probably not in terms of quality good. And that could be skewing your data. Again, also due to chance, but also heterogeneity due to poor choice of effect measure. And again, I've included another resource in the resource guide about what standardized effect size you should be using. And I've seen recent sort of controversy around using certain effect sizes for your standardized measurement, specifically Hedges G. And I'm happy to talk about that more in depth afterwards. But the other thing is that, in the study, whatever constructs they're measuring, did they actually measure them with the correct statistical test, right? And again, this is information that you can take from your data characteristics table and explain that in your results in your discussion, right? That it could be also due to, the way in which they measured the relationship between these two constructs wasn't really relevant, right, given the research question. So right now we've talked about the forest plot and we've talked about the funnel plot. But let's say we had, some of the data characteristics that we wanted to look into further and potentially look at subgroup analyses. So I'm actually going to try to do this right now. Let's see if I can do that. Okay. So I'm going to actually show you guys an output of what it looks like to do subgroup analyses. And again, at a time at the end, I can actually show you how to walk through this. It's very simple. So you're going to click on Analyze. You're going to click on or you're going to click on Meta-Analysis, Continuous Variables, and it's going to pop up Subgroup. You're going to click on Subgroup, and then you're going to choose, well, what subgroup do we want to look at? So let's say I had in my data set, I coded the different ways in which cortisol was looked at. And let's say it was looked at in 3 different ways. It was measured by hair, it was measured by blood, and it was measured by hair, blood, and saliva. And we know in the literature, again, I'm positioning this in my, hypotheses or my research questions, is that sometimes, hair cortisol measurements are thought to be less precise than blood, right? So we would assume that maybe there's a statistically significant different effect size across the different methods, such that maybe, there's a stronger relation between blood cortisol and race-related stress versus hair. So quite simply, what you do is you put in that categorical variable and it produces this output. It's very similar to our forest plot that we looked at before. The only difference here is that it's giving us these subgroup analyses. Now you can see A here, let's say that, I'll get my laser out again. We have A here, we have B, let's say that was saliva, and then we have C here, which was, let's say the B was blood and then C was saliva. So we could say overall, okay, there was in the subgroup of blood, there's a higher effect size, right? 0.51 as compared to 0.44 down here and 0.36. And we can look to the right and visually see that, okay, yep, the effect size is smaller here as compared to blood. And then it's actually interesting with if we were to say this is a real data set, with the saliva, it's around the middle of the actual overall pooled effect size. But then looking back down here, what it does is it's taking the actual random effects model and looking at the homogeneity across groups. And again, it's going to test whether, going back to that definition, the variability in effect sizes between groups is greater than what we would expect by chance. So if we look at the Q statistic coupled with the p-value, this is indicating that, well, the probability of observing the Q statistic under the null hypothesis is that there's no true difference between the subgroups. And again, coupled with the p-value, meaning there's no, again, strong evidence against the null hypothesis. So it's implying that, this is pretty homogeneous, right? Or talking about statistically significant. It's not statistically significant in heterogeneity. So not a lot of variability across methods. Now, this is a hypothetical data set, not real. And so I would actually think that blood would produce a stronger effect, but we're just using this for workshop intents and purposes. So I will pause right now. I'm gonna look at the time. So this is, again, embedded into the presentation. And this is actually a step-by-step guide. It's Meta Excel, and it shows you how to do a different type of meta-analysis. So today we did in this workshop a meta-analysis that looked at the relationship between 2 constructs, right? So again, that relationship between race-related stress and cortisol output. But there are research questions that you really can't answer with the methods we just talked about. And that's this idea of prevalence, which is another very contentious construct when we're thinking about prevalence. And this research team that I put the citation in the PowerPoint goes step by step and talks about, well, how do you actually create effect sizes from prevalence? And they were in this study specifically, they created a synthetic data set to look at the prevalence of multiple sclerosis in a subpopulation. And they wanted to see across studies what is the prevalence and generate an overall effect size to see the true, quote unquote, true prevalence across these studies across comprehensively. Now, this would require different data input, right? Because we're dealing with different inferential statistics. And again, Meta-Excel is really great if you want to use, again, analyses to look at prevalence of a construct across time or across studies. I want to also note something that we did not get to do today, which is looking at, or how do we use meta-analysis to look at the effect of a treatment. That is a completely different topic and workshop in itself. I wish I had the whole day to talk with you all about how to do that. I don't. Again, I've put some resources in the resource guide, and I'm more than happy to talk with folks that are interested specifically in that. But again, we're thinking about, approaching meta-analysis introductory. It's really helpful to get this kind of introduction in just looking at the relation between two constructs, because then you can start to think, well, if we find that there's a medium effect size between cortisol output and race-related stress, that can inform not only just treatment and how we would intervene, but also, well, what are these methods that they're using? Maybe in 90% of the studies, they used a yes or no question for race-related stress, right? And we know that conceptualizing and operationalizing race-related stress is not just this yes or no question, right? So you can signal that. You can also signal, well, what are the treatments that are out there? Maybe you want to then do a follow-up meta-analysis that looks at biological interventions for race-related stress, right? So again, the ways in which your research question is posited will inform the type of meta-analysis that you do. So we're coming up close to that 1 hour 30 mark, I believe. So after this workshop, you're going to be given a couple things. The first thing, again, is that sample data set to practice with. And I included the subgroup analyses that you all can use and play around with. If folks would like, I created a newer data set that has some moderators. If you would like to also play around with doing potential moderator analyses, I know we didn't get to do that today. But again, I have a complete reading guide that talks about things for further analyses, such as moderation. And then after the workshop, I'm going to be sending a statistical sheet that basically talks about standard error, confidence intervals, variance, sample size, Q statistic, and sort of how mathematically do those all actually come out. Because I think, while you shouldn't have to do all these things by hand, it's important to see where statistically these numbers are coming from. So what I'm hoping is that, again, going back to this like mountain metaphor, we have you, me, your study, and there's like a bunch of fog before, right? It's like gatekeeping, lack of resources, bias, and like who can do a meta-analysis and who cannot. And I'm hoping that this workshop today helped kind of lighten the fog a little bit and help you see that you can achieve doing a meta-analysis. It is achievable, it is doable, it is manageable. It is all about, again, your research question, how you're approaching it, and again, inviting collaboration. So again, I can't thank you all enough for listening to my workshop today. It's actually the first workshop I've ever given as a professional. So it's been really exciting to do that. Please know, again, this is not exhaustive. There are meta workshops that span multiple days. There's semester courses on metas. But I think these methodologies are really important. I think they can uncover key disparities. And I think it can just guide researchers to say, well, this is where the story goes next. So I thank you all. I thank Black and Psych. I also thank my secondary advisor, Dr. William O'Brien. He trained me on meta-analysis. If there's any questions that you have that you can't get answered today, please email me. I'm more than happy to meet with folks, more than happy to chat one-on-one, email, correspond about whatever your questions are. I'm also hoping to send out a feedback form just to get information on what you enjoyed about the workshop, what I could include, because I just want to make this, again, as inclusive and informative as possible for future talks. And all of the information that you're going to be sent will also be on my website. So you'll get this PowerPoint slide, and that QR code will have all the information on there. But that is my workshop. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you. for finding out that it's your first one. I thought it was amazing. First off, you talked for like an hour and a half, and that's incredible. So, I think that's the first level, and then all the information you provided, such a help, such a great thing. I think it was a really great like starting place for people if you've never done it before. And even if you have, like for me, it's been a while, just a reminder of all the things you can actually do with a meta-analysis. So thank you for that. Um, Again, like I said in the comments, this information will be sent out in the next few days. I know that me and Jocelyn will not be able to get the stuff out today, but in the next few days, we'll make sure the recording is up on our YouTube and also all of the materials that are needed or that were provided for you all today. Um, yeah, if there's anything else, again, you can always reach out to us on Black and Psych on our website, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram. And if you have any ideas or have any more thoughts, we're working on our spring. We're probably gonna take a break for the fall. The summer was a little intense for us, but we are starting off with maybe a winter going into the spring. So if you have anything you all want to talk about or you want people to talk about, let us know and we will find somebody to do a workshop on it. And that's about it. So thank you all and have a great day.